aerospace engineering story I really like, which is that the invention of the helicopter by Igor Sikorsky. The interesting backstory to that is he arrived in the US as an immigrant, and he was kind of working almost as a laborer, even though he'd been a famous aircraft designer in Russia. And he was like, not as a laborer, but blue collar work in aircraft design. And at one point, he got into touch with the Russian composer Rachmaninoff. And Rachmaninoff actually gave him $5,000, which is about $100,000 in today's money. And that's how the funding of the helicopter originally came about. And the reason I love this story is that it's a major narrative violation, like the idea of industry and engineering creating wealth, and then like wealth funding art and culture. And this is a backward story of like a famous musician who was already rich and established, taking a struggling engineering inventor and helping fund the development of the helicopter. And the reason this story is relevant is, in a way, this entire Summer of Protocols program, which had like a whole kind of like technology engineering angle to it, exists because of Ian. And the story is, I first got to know of Ian when I did a talk at the Serpentine Art Gallery in London. And the curator there handed me a book and said, the author wants you to have it. And that book was Ian's book. I have it on somewhere. It's called The Emissary's Guide to Worlding. And that got Ian and me talking, and we went back and forth and wrote a little blog post series together, one of which Ian shared as his pre-read. And then I invited him for a salon at Berggruen. But sometime along the way, Ian actually NFT sniped me. He said, I want to take the illustration I did for the Ribbon Farm post and turn it into an NFT. So we sort of like were co-minters of the NFT and foundation. And that got me into playing around with, Web3 stuff. I started playing around with all the stuff that was coming out in 2019. And then that's how I think Tim first kind of like noticed what I was up to. And Tim, I think, bought one of my first NFTs, and Tim and I got to talking. And that eventually led to the Summer of Protocols. So funny, longer version of Rachmaninoff funding Sikorsky. But yeah, Ian, thank you for helping in a very roundabout way making the Summer Protocols happen. And Ian is, I think, one of the leading artists today, not just in terms of like the art content, which some of you will appreciate, those of you are in art as well, but also in terms of like exploring new media. So he's one of the first artists to really explore what you can do with game engines as a way to like create art. So instead of video games, can you create entire worlds? And that was his original sort of like claim to fame. Then he did work with NFTs, starting with the simple ones that he did with people like me to really complex ones. Like there's an NFT done that takes the contents of your wallet and tries to present your identity in terms of the wallet contents. And most recently, he's worked on a really cool animated short also built in a game engine that explores kind of like various notions of identity in what I would call protocolized environments. And I think part of the development of that animated short was in the short story he shared as a pre-read. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff to talk about. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ian, and let's talk art and protocols.
Cool. Thank you for the introduction. And I guess I'm happy to have gotten you into this ecosystem, but also sorry. It's a funny moment when I did a split contract on Foundation with this Ribbon Farm drawing. And I guess that forced you to, if you had a wallet, to activate the wallet and to actually like accept funds when it finally sold. I think maybe that's a nice way to start because, the experience of that for me was also very fresh and very new. And before that moment, doing that very, very, very first NFT, I was really on the sidelines just watching what was happening in the NFT ecosystem. And it wasn't until actually just doing it and then like, NFT sniping you along, that the visceral experience of like being along for the auction, engaging with people to do with like a real thing, that the texture of that experience really made all the difference. It touched all parts of my body in a way rather than just my mind. And I think my experience as an artist has been converging more and more to, seems so stupid, but it's been encouraging more and more toward trying to recreate experiences like that, and also trying to set up my art practice so I'm more in touch with that way of knowing, which I guess is a more subconscious and unconscious way, learned through experience rather than through, I guess, like the perusal of ideas. And maybe I want to start, if I can share my screen. Does that work? Yeah, I'm just gonna share my computer. Let's just do it like this. Can you guys see? Can you guys see this? Yeah, I thought I'd just begin by, I think what does art and protocols have to do with each other? I'm not totally sure yet, but I thought I'd kind of give a brief tour of my trajectory as an artist, and maybe we'll kind of find some things along the way that might interest you, and leave some time for questions at the end. But I wanted to show you the very first work I kind of ever did professionally as an artist. It's this work called This Papaya Tastes Perfect. And it was this is in 2011. It was an animation, a mocap animation. I had watched, I previously worked at Industrial Light and Magic as my first job out of Berkeley as an undergrad in cognitive science. And at ILM, it's George Lucas's like post-production VFX company, and people were doing like crazy mocap stuff at the time. Like I remember at the time they were doing Pirates of the Caribbean, but they were doing this crazy octopus creature called Davy Jones, who was like the antagonist of the film. And they were doing it all on set. So like Johnny Depp would be acting on set on the pirate ship with this actor, Bill Nighy, in a mocap suit. And this is really innovative at the time because they're doing mocap, not in a mocap studio, but not in like a full-on set. And they were tracking various kind of patterns on the kind of the mocap suit that he had, plus these markers, plus some inertial trackers. And they've innovated a way to like really do mocap live with other actors in situ. And so I was really inspired by this. It was so innovative at the time. And when I left to come to New York, one of the first projects I did after grad school was to think a lot about this experience I had, like being so wowed by this experience with mocap, but also feeling like so much of it was cleaned up in the post-production process to produce a very, very polished and ultimately animated version of Davy Jones's performance. And so I was in New York in 2011, and I saw this like street fight kind of like down on the East River in the financial district. It was like this large Australian couple, and they had stopped the car in the middle of the road. It was a kind of a taxi car, and they were starting to chase the driver around the car. I guess like maybe the taxi almost hit them, but they were very drunk. And then this kind of like Tom and Jerry thing happened, but it was a three-way Tom and Jerry. And then eventually the taxi driver like dived into his car, managed to pull out a hammer and like wildly swung at both of them and hit both of them. And then the cops came maybe like 5 minutes later. But I was really struck by this experience. It was so raw. And I was also struck by, as an artist, like thinking about motion capture, thought, oh, can I kind of recreate this memory, but with the kind of a motion capture performance that felt like uninhibited and raw. And maybe I'll just play a little bit so you can see. I guess the reason why I bring this up is I had exactly 1 month to make this work. I was offered a show in Miami at a friend's gallery. It's like the first offer I ever had as an artist to do anything. And so I took it very seriously. And I'd gone through all these other more conceptual ideas about what the show could be, things that might be like critical of. Oh, wait, let me share it with sound. This might be better. Let's do this. Can you hear that? We'll just watch a second of it. I'll just talk over it. Yeah, so I was I wanted to really capture this kind of rawness, and I had 1 month to do this thing, and I got through all these other like kind of more conceptual ideas. And ultimately, I like this thing's just kind of stuck with me, both the memory and also the desire, just like the burning energy, the kind of demonic energy to want to do something with motion capture, but very raw and very ugly. And when the deadline was looming, I just went for it. I rented a motion capture studio, like on its off hours. I got my friend Madeline Hollander, who was a choreographer. She got her friend to act all the parts, and we just did it. And most of the time, most of the work was actually editing the mocap, this like crazy mocap session together, almost like the way you would edit like a film or a movie, but instead of editing like images, you're editing little chunks of motion on a 3D avatar together. So it's kind of Frankensteining a choreography together. And I think something about the speed and the energy of the creation of the work and the energy of in this troubling incident that I'd seen, that I was trying to work out for myself what it meant, and an energy of like not having time to clean up the motion capture nor the desire to, and the energy of like a one-day shoot, all that coalesced, I felt, into something that I still look back on. I mean, it's a very flawed work, but it's something that captures a certain unconscious energy that in a way I'm still chasing as an artist. So shortly, well, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there for this. Yeah, it's a kind of unconscious energy that I start capturing, and this raw nerve that, as you'll see in subsequent works, the production timelines started to expand and expand and expand, and like that energy can easily get lost as an artist. And so I always think about this work, and the reason why I'm showing it to you is because I'm in the midst of something right now, and I want to think about this work too, because I think it really helped me keep a North Star toward a certain kind of desire to speak a language of an unconscious, or desire to speak a language of kind of a subconscious language. You'll notice also just the sound design. I told my friend, who was like he kind of used to be like a guitarist and a singer, just like, watch this cut of this silent thing that I just put together, and like speak as if like, when you're driving fast in the car and you're watching a couple argue on the street, but you're going so fast you can't hear the contents of what they're saying, but you can hear the energy and the kind of the emotionality of it. Like, speak in that language, like just say that stuff. And I think there's something so, okay, believe me, when I got these takes, I thought, oh, this is so stupid, but it's like such a bad idea. But some part of me was compelled to just like, let's just do it. Like, we're not going to put words to this. There's no time for that, but there's something to this. And I thought, okay, like this is an energy this really set me off. Like, I can make a career out of this. And so I started working shortly thereafter. This was actually quite tedious in the 1 month that I was making it. And you could say, even though it was mocaps, like collaging together all the motion capture started to become like as tedious as doing animation, which I love as a fan of animation. But for any of you who've ever animated anything, you know that you can kind of perfect an animation forever. And it's only until someone tells you to drop your pencil that you actually stop. And so I wanted to get away from this idea of perfection as an artist. Felt that it was a trap. And so I started experimenting with the Unity video game engine, which is at the time, this is like around 2012, 2013, which was a commercially available video game engine that had a really rich ecosystem of like developer support, like people on forums. So you could just kind of teach yourself. Let me show you briefly the first work of that. It was a simulation called Entropy Wrangler. Let me play it here. I'll keep it playing. I kind of thought of it as like kind of like a sort of very subjective Big Bang. Like I just kind of stuck in a virtual simulation in the Unity game engine. I just modeled all the things like I just was thinking about at the time. Very like a very dumb premise for an artwork, like just stuff I liked. But I assigned different physical properties to each object. And like, for example, some of the stuff was like this little rotating like moon scaled object had a kind of stickiness to it. Some things could stretch. Some things were like very breakable and the shards would then like damage other things. So it's kind of just a sandbox that I was trying to produce. And in the context of art, he didn't want to introduce the idea of a player, although that was, Unity really urges you to do that. Instead, I thought of it as a kind of a video game that plays itself. I thought the underlying kind of properties of each object would produce emergent effects, very simple ones and very chaotic ones. But for me, it's like, oh, this is finally something I could watch where it feels like animation, but it's pretty unpredictable in the way that like Norwegian slow TV or like a fireplace is unpredictable. There's a kind of regularity in the pattern of unpredictableness. And then once in a while, like with a fireplace, like a log kind of like dislodges and like produces a bigger flame, or like in Norwegian slow TV, the train passes by, I don't know, a goat and a cow like doing something funny in the corner. And these little moments became a way, I think, for me as an artist to really start to think about a viewer's attention. When we think about movies, you're on the edge of your seat, a good movie, but even a bad movie, I'd argue, you kind of, your brain is primed to want to pay kind of a stressful kind of attention to it because you want to see what's going on. You want to know what the problem is. You want to find the clues to resolving the problem, both the objective problem and the emotional problem of the story. And I thought, okay, well, that's an attention span that's a kind of wavelength of attention that is maybe appropriate for cinema. Like what's appropriate for art, like art in a gallery, art that's you see in a physical space that has supposed to have a kind of presence on your body as a viewer. I thought, oh, maybe we could get to a kind of attention that has this electricity of aliveness, again, like the way like looking at animals in a park or like a fireplace has, where you could have this ambient attention level, kind of a low commitment attention level. And suddenly there's elements in it that spark this kind of high attention focus. And it could be this surface that you could kind of flicker and have a parallax between both forms of attention. Quite different from cinema where you're just kind of, you're engaged in the problem. Here you can be disengaged. You could kind of talk to your friend, leave the room, maybe come back another day. It's still there waiting for you. And there's still little minor super micro dramas that you could kind of dive in and appreciate, but you can shift, your focus of your eye and like, zoom out and appreciate like a non-problem in the corner or just like something quite beautiful in the corner. I wanted to create a kind of a canvas, a space where all those forms of attention were allowed for the viewer to kind of flicker between. And I think as the first simulation I made, this was for me like a real breakthrough personally. I would say over time, though, I made about 10 different kinds of simulations over time, just kind of experimenting with the form, the idea that these things could go on infinitely, like should there be a protagonist that you focus on, should there not be? Eventually, I found that there was sort of a underlying lack of meaning in all of it. At certain points in the process of making these simulations as they got more complex, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I didn't know why I was inserting certain elements versus others. And if you've ever worked on a long-ish project, there's certain moments of doubt that you just kind of, you just want to collapse and just like not do the project. And I started having increasing frequency of these moments where I started a project and didn't want to finish it. Start a project, I got stuck, or I didn't know why I was pursuing a certain element. And this despair, I noticed this pattern of despair, and I thought, oh, something has to change. How am I going to do this differently? And so I started, two things. My wife introduced me to one of her best friends, a girl called Veronica So, and she was a video game producer at the time. And my wife said, oh, Ian, it looks like you're spending a lot of time on some tiny technical aspect of your simulation or some tiny aesthetic aspect. Like maybe if you had a producer, get some perspective, maybe you could also get some help. So that was one element. And then the other element was to start to think about what's the opposite of a simulation? What's the kind of the holder of meaning? Typically, I think we can all, I thought at the time it was the notion of storytelling or story, right? It's a very finite, authored, scripted sequence of events that produce some sort of meaning. Thought, oh shit, what if you could collide a story with a simulation? What would what would happen then? If those were two sculptural forces, I already had a simulation going. What if there was a story that was running through it and trying to tell itself amidst the chaos of a simulation? And what if the simulation could kind of corrupt or infect the linearity of the story and break it, force it to accidentally tell a different story or force it to not complete itself? And so that was the beginning of a project called Emissaries, which turned into 3 simulations. I would say maybe the other thing I want to mention there is once I started on this idea, let me find a picture. I got super excited by this idea of these 2 sculptural forces, and I started on the first Emissaries called Emissary and Squad of Gods. But just to say real quick, immediately my mind, I was working with a producer. I'm like, okay, we're gonna do 3 of these. And it wasn't out of like hubris to want to do like a gargantuan project. It was this idea that like, oh shit, I remember too well, like that scary moment in a project where it all falls through and you don't know what means what, and you're stuck with technical problems and artistic problems, people problems. If I can make this a trilogy, well, then whatever problems I have in this first one, if I don't work them out, maybe they can work themselves out in the next one. And, whatever problems I have now, like, I know I'm on a larger journey. So the pressure like was suddenly relieved from me by making this a trilogy. I mean, I speculated that was a trilogy. I thought I was pretty sure I was going to finish it. I didn't really know, but I felt that really gave me a life draft to actually pursue the trouble of making these projects, especially the first one. The first one was definitely the hardest. Let me just show you some pictures of it. Well, let's watch a video. I'm showing you videos, by the way. They're actually, they're applications. They're like a video game that plays itself. So these are just screen recordings.
Wrong. Wrong.
So that little girl in kind of the red smock, she's the emissary. So she's the one character agent, I would say. She's the one agent with a pre-scripted story, kind of a plan for the day. And her plan is very simple. She's just trying to convince each of the different members of her kind of extended family here, who are living on the side of an active volcano but don't realize it yet. She's trying to convince them to leave. Meanwhile, all the other characters you see, these are agents where we implemented a kind of an AI architecture based on The Sims. This is kind of a classic version. But The Sims had a very, very elegant model of old-fashioned AI, which was their idea was that you give each sim a set of needs, a set of internal motivations like hunger, thirst, desire to play, desire to sleep, and those needs are satisfied by objects in the environment. The objects in the environment advertise to each agent a satisfaction of that need. So it's kind of this idea that intelligence is sort of distributed between the agent and the kind of various affordances in the environment. And so any given object could, kind of a jug of water could advertise a satisfaction of thirst, but it could equally advertise a satisfaction of, you throw this at your friend and it's kind of form of play, or you like bash someone else on the head. It's a form of maybe fight or flight. And so we populated the landscape with a lot of these objects that have these various kind of micro dramas scripted onto them. And then the agents have a series of depleting needs, and they try to seek the ones that are the most urgent and available. The drama of it was that this emissary character had to get through all these agents with various needs. It's kind of like a really bad version of The Sims. She had to get through all these agents with various needs, and often they would recruit her because some of these scripts were sort of social practices that required they had slotted different roles to be fulfilled by different agents. So she would often get recruited into these kind of procedural social practices, and then therefore not finish her scripted mandate to get everyone off the mountain. Sometimes by sheer chance, she would manage to evade all of those things and convince everyone to leave. And sometimes the volcano would just explode. And it's kind of had a kind of Groundhog Day structure. Like you could just kind of play this out, and wherever the agent, the emissary succeeds or fails, it would kind of start over again, play out differently, start over again, play differently. And this was a real breakthrough for me, to try to introduce this narrative element in tension with the simulation. But it also really kicked off a deep interest in AI. And maybe I'll just jump ahead a little bit to the next thing. So after this project, I made a simulation called Bob, which stands for Bag of Beliefs. Maybe I'll walk through a little bit of the making of. Back up a little and just to say, like, a lot of these projects start from drawings and kind of these like wacky like diagrams, thinking about the aspects of the project that I want intention. But Bob started as this idea that, okay, after emissaries and making these kind of multi-agent simulations using very old-fashioned AI techniques, what if we could really focus on just one creature, and the canvas of that work, the edges of that work were the creature's like birth and the creature's death, and like the compositional space would be how its life unfolded. And to really unfold it in a compelling way, you'd have to start to, I told myself, you'd have to start to simulate almost like you'd have to make an artificial life simulation. And to do that, well, you'd have to have an AI model that actually learned from its experiences. And I was making this around 2017 and 2018. I mean, deep learning, wasn't as, commercially accessible as it is now. So I had this idea that, again, ideas start from the dumbest places. Like I had this dream. It was like of a tree that like got up from itself, unrooted itself, and started walking around. And the head started to look like a snake that then fractalized into like various branches. And I thought, oh, what if the body of Bob was a visualization of its underlying AI model? In parallel to that, I was kind of starting to research this neurosymbolic model of AI developed by a guy at DeepMind called Richard Evans. Super brilliant guy. He actually did the AI for Sims 3 in a really classic game called Black and White. He devised a very interesting method, I think it's been advanced since, in which he combined inductive logic programming with deep learning to actually get a model, how do I say, a cognitive architecture where you could sense unstructured data, let's say from a camera stream or just a stream of bits, and the system would actually find a rule that produced a unified pattern for what that stream of input meant. So over time, it could use the rules that it created, basically little functions, and apply those to new situations as a form of as a forward pass, as a form of inference, so that every inference it made came with a very strong inductive bias, biased by these rules. And so it could, for example, learn the difference between, I don't know, a dog and a cat in like 2 examples versus 100,000 examples, which classic deep learning architectures need. And I thought, wow, this is like much more closer to animal cognition, definitely closer to human cognition. And it suggests that, yeah, like your brain isn't just, I mean, we know this, but your visual cortex maybe is much more like a deep learning network. But at some point, perhaps the cortical columns in your neocortex are producing higher level models that are interchangeable and generalizable across domains that can then be applied as a strong inductive bias to new domains. So like when I go to, I don't know, I went to Korea last year. When I go to Korea, I apply all my inductive bias to what cities are like, so I won't feel lost. Of course, I'm half wrong. I don't know all the customs. I don't know the exact way the city is structured, but I know enough to kind of start to steer myself and know where I'm wrong and incorrect for that. And so far, all other deep learning systems cannot do this. That's why, even GPT, the P in GPT is pre-trained. It's not continuously learning. But if you were to make a system that was continuously learning, I think it would need some strong inductive bias somewhere along the lines of what Richard Evans was proposing. Anyways, we implemented a very early version of one of his papers, and of course adapted it to a 3D environment for a very specific need for this creature called Bob. Bob stands for bag of beliefs. Beliefs being the set of rules that Bob created over the course of its lifetime that helped it navigate a very simple environment with very simple objects in it. But all the objects had, the meaning of those objects didn't have their meaning pre-given. Bob had to learn the meaning of those objects. And so the funny thing about Bob is that if you gave Bob a poisonous apple very early in its infancy, and it ate the apple and received pain, it would have an extremely negative valence toward vaguely red-shaped round objects. And sometimes that would prevent Bob from eating anything red or being adverse to everything red. The inductive bias of that one rule completely turned its whole life into a cul-de-sac, and Bob would die in a day. And let me show you Bob real quick, because that might be easier to understand. How can I show you Bob? Show you a screen recording of Bob. Or I can show you making of Bob's first. Let's do that. Again, projects start really stupid. Bob started as this kind of seaweed monster, very ugly, very dumb. But I think compelling in its movement, very naturalistic. I want to add that we went hardcore on Bob too and its body design. Normally, in 3D animation, when you have a character design, you kind of just rig it like it's a sculpture, and then it's one kind of envelope. But we tried to simulate Bob, piece by piece. So Bob was composed of modular parts connected together by a ball spring physics system. So we could have this gummy animation quality you see in classic animation, but we could also break Bob. We could also identify and target particular body parts of Bob. Different body parts could have sensors that are, discrete and accurate, specific enough. And it was also a way to procedurally grow Bob. So if we're talking about life and death, Bob started small, and then as its beliefs and as its kind of eating habits changed, its body would reflect that. So Bob eventually turned into something kind of like this. Its movement is also procedurally generated. So it's using the ball spring physics system. It's also abiding by, it's the natural force of when you push down on something, like how your feet push down on something, you're counteracting gravity, so the other parts of your body push up. And so this was very fun to find kind of expressive postures in Bob's body to express underlying kind of maybe emotional states. Initially, I gave Bob a little friend. Again, it was one of these mid-project things where I thought, oh, it needs something. I have to overcomplicate it. Bob needs a foil. Bob needs an opponent. Bob needs a little buddy. Woody has Buzz Lightyear. He needs his Buzz Lightyear. I thought, oh, it would be this sacrificial water buffalo. That you would think, obviously Bob's the more fearsome animal here. Bob would either attack it or covet it, and you'd be on your toes as to what Bob would do with this sedate water buffalo with a much simpler AI model governing it. Eventually we axed that. My producer got mad at me because I was just wasting time with the water buffalo. Here is some kind of movement pattern, procedural walking. And I just want to show you it flips here. We can flip it. Yeah, so just by changing some of the just really basic settings on how the nodes are behaving, you can kind of shift its posture. So here it's more oh, there's a head, and now it's more I don't know, this is kind of dragon-like. But then it can kind of switch into a kind of cacti-like posture. Anyways, Um, yeah, this is Bob being very like creepy, like snake. This is Bob breaking. So this is quite important for, I think, just as an artist, like just getting that, again, this unconscious thing, like if you see a creature and you're already simulating it, it's on a screen, to get that reality, the texture of reality, the texture that your unconscious would recognize. Oh, you need to see things touch each other, and you need to see things break. So often in 3D animation, especially video games, you don't see things break. You know, like you shoot something in Fortnite and then it just kind of, there's effects and then like something despawns and disappears. I just wanted to see Bob break, and the remnants of like its broken limbs just like persist in the environment for a long enough time where it actually counted in the mind of the viewer. I'm just gonna skip ahead to just, I think we should show you Bob real quick. Show your recording. Where can you find it? Oh yeah, this is real quick. This is just a peek of Bob's, like a kind of diagnostic view of Bob's underlying AI model. So two things about this. I just want to say, we implemented this kind of, this differential inductive logic programming model. So you can learn in a few examples. And it can learn it, in our case, is very limited to a certain set of predicates. You can see them here, like is nourishing, and whatever the opposite of that is, basically is poisonous. These various predicates is basically learning the meaning of the various objects set against these various predicates. And then simultaneously, it had a set of, I call them demons, I call them the Congress of Demons, a set of internal motivations, similar to how I described the emissaries in The Sims, where they have these set of internal needs. But a little bit more advanced in that each demon had its own internal script, almost like a little story that it wanted to tell or that it was pursuing. So a dumb one would be like the eater demon, you know, it needs to pursue the story of finding food, going after it, putting it in its mouth and consuming that food. And that story was very important for the cognitive architecture of Bob for the reason of Bob's perception. It necessarily limited Bob's perception when that demon was active, meaning that demon could only see things in the environment that it already scanned for that seemed like either food or like tools for food, and everything. And also it could scan for things that were obstacles to food, or things that were like, you know, kind of poison, it believed to be poisonous. Everything else is irrelevant. And that narrowed the search space for Bob's perception a lot. And this was like computationally, this was like a huge win. Like, how do you deal with the problem of perception where everything is equally relevant? Like, that's what happens when you're on LSD or mushrooms. Everything is like overly relevant. Every little crack in the ground is like so cool. But actually, I think this is true of animal behavior. I think it's true of us, that our perception is very constrained by what our current motivation is, or a set of motivations are. And we only actually see in terms of our motivation, unless you're really looking in some Zen state, wanting to see. And so that really helped with Bob's just computational like architecture, and making Bob actually quite both energy efficient and also computationally efficient. And the last thing I will say about Bob, maybe as we play this video, here, I'll play it here so you can just get a taste of what Bob looks like. Again, very simple environment. What you see up here, these little like, they look like stars. These were called Bob shrines. And so we found very early on that with this AI architecture, where Bob's kind of learning the rules of what things mean as it goes, that Bob could really paint itself in a corner with its beliefs and basically starve to death or produce beliefs that really like weren't in its self-interest, just for basic survival. And I realized, oh, we needed a parental force. Like, we needed someone to tell Bob, like, that red thing that maybe you had a bad experience with it, like if it's shaped like this and has a green leaf on it, it's actually a good, yummy, perfectly nutritious apple here, and force into Bob's mouth. I'm a dad. I became a dad of two, like in the last few years. And so I like forcing like green foods into my kids' mouth. Like, they hated green foods. And then like they had avocado, they had like guacamole, and then that all changed. I realized we needed a parental force with Bob in the form of this app. So this app, you can make offerings to Bob. It's called Bob Shrine. You can make offerings to Bob, and you could pair with those offerings a parental caption. So maybe you made an offering of a mushroom to Bob, and it was Bob previously had beliefs that mushrooms were poisonous. You could pair with it like mushroom is yummy, and then Bob would be forced, at least the first time that Bob touched your shrine star and it deposited your offering, to listen to that parental voice, and that would productively upset Bob's like beliefs that it had about mushrooms. Of course, people like did malicious things too, which is fully intent as well, where they might say like mushrooms are delicious and offer Bob like clearly poisonous mushrooms, and Bob would try it. Bob would feel like get sick or die, and then the next time Bob encountered that shrine again, it would ignore that shrine. It would produce a negative valence toward that particular shrine. So people would have to like create new accounts and things like this. Last thing I'll say about Bob is Bob also could die, and so every time Bob died, we erased 80% of its beliefs and like retained 20%, kind of like epigenetics sort of thing. I want to just super fast forward because I realize we're short on time. Briefly, right after this, I was expecting my first daughter, Eden, and this was around 2019, and I started to make I decided like I'm gonna make an animated film for kids. Like that's an easy thing. That'll be way easier to do than AI, and it turned out to be like the hardest thing I've ever done. And so I made this thing called Life After Bob. Let me share a link with you on YouTube for those of you interested in actually watching it. I just put it online, so I'll drop in the chat here. But without going into too much detail about it, basically it's I'll show you a little bit behind the scenes, maybe that's of interest. Basically, it's a 50-minute long kind of anime-inspired film about a 10-year-old girl who has this AI also called Bob, implanted in her brain by her father when she's born. And Bob starts to kind of be like an inner life coach, a kind of personal model, which I think is something that's kind of floating there now, personal AI model for her, and ends up she abdicates more and more responsibility to her Bob. And meanwhile, her dad starts to fall in love with the Bob side of her. And Bob has full access to her nervous system with her permission. So Bob can kind of drone her body and help her walk up a flight of stairs that she's too lazy to walk up, like have arguments and resolve conflicts with her father, while Chalice, the main character, she's mentally off somewhere else on the neural internet. And over time, her father falls more and more in love with the Bob side of her. And then, of course, her human consciousness starts to wonder, like, what's left for me to do? But just to say, the production of that was also in Unity. We tried really hard to establish some norms for how to make a movie in Unity. I mean, this was kind of the meta project of making this. So you can see here, basically amounts to making a kind of a theater, like kind of a stage, like a theater set, stage play. Here, if I play it, you'll see the characters, you could compose the frame any way you want. And this was, for me as a director, made me feel more like an artist. We had a huge team for this because there's so many scenes, but I always wanted to feel like an artist amongst all this. I know with director friends of mine that, being a director, you're delegating so much, and the cost of rewriting a scene, restaging a scene, reacting a scene is extremely cost prohibitive and very expensive. But if you did in a video game engine, which is what we try to do, you basically have a live play all the time that you can kind of recompose. I was changing props and lighting, sets, like all the way to the last minute of the project. And here's a cinematic view down here. Oops. Maybe one other element to point out is when we presented this, we presented a cinematic version, and then we also presented a version called world watching, where you could, with your phone, you can pause it like a Netflix remote control or Apple TV remote, but then you can also click on anything in the environment, and then the virtual camera would zoom in on it, and it would pull up stuff from like the Life After Bob wiki, and you could rotate around it. And sometimes when you rotate around it, there were other objects hidden in the set. And then you could start to like explore the kind of the lore of those objects too. And this all was inspired by my daughter, who, when I was reading her like this little book called Big Red Barn about like little animals going to sleep at night, she got so sick of the story, but she loved the animals, and she would always want me to go kind of improvise about what the cow was doing to the chicken in the scene, and just kind of make up a story as we go along. And she would always say, go in. Her name's Eden. And she would say, Eden, go in. Like she didn't want to go forward or backwards. She wanted to go in. And so I thought, oh, it'd be so beautiful. This is like my dream of media, children's media. Like you could watch a movie and metabolize the narrative, start to get a hint of the world, start to love the characters, and then you could go into it. You could explore the world in the same medium very fluidly. And so we implemented a version of that. It's kind of an experiment in doing Life After Bob. I could keep talking, but I think maybe should leave some time for some Q&A, and I can also get into some newer projects as well. But maybe I'll leave it there for now, and let's talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian, for that walkthrough of some of your work and the motivations behind it. I'm going to go ahead and stop your screen share here and pull up the Discord screen here so you can give a little look into some of the stuff that's been discussed as you've been talking. And if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand and we can do some Q&A here. Yeah, Dorian.
Yeah, I'll take one. First of all, this reminds me the sort of art in Unity, which the first time I saw this was Liu Yang. I think it was Ghost in the Machine or something like that is what it was called, but that was like an actual installation in Meat Space. And it had the same, very similar contours as sort of these agent-based kind of, not kind of a game, but not really. But you got me thinking about Lev Manovich in his book, I think it's called The Language of New Media. It was like 20 plus years old, where he was talking about the Syntam versus paradigm and how like narrative in the pre-digital world had to do with, a single path was the forward thing, and the paradigm, the sort of the universe of discourse was in the background and kind of unspoken. And he his sort of argument was that the digital media inverts that. So and you just sort of got me thinking about how you've got this movie, which is a narrative end to end, but then you sort of got the universe in it as well. I mean, I have a million things that I think are super interesting about this, but yeah, that's the first and only for now.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think at the time I was also like kind of sort of writing about worlding and thinking about worlds. So I really wanted to like, practice what I preach and try to make a world. Yeah.
I have a question. I guess since you worked so much on this and you've developed intuitions on this, it seems to me that a lot of people getting started with fiction writing invariably find that it's both more fun and easier to do world building than it is to actually write stories, because stories have like all those constraints of plots and arcs, and it actually has to have like twists and turns and land somewhere good. But one of the fun things I've seen with like ChatGPT and like the AI generation stuff is you can give it a lot of essentially world building context and say, this is the world. I'm going to describe so much stuff in the background. Now write me a story for it. Like that was one of the first little experiments I did with it. Like I would give it some context and ask it to write like stories. And it came up with like pretty lousy stories. But the good thing was I didn't have to write them. It did all the sort of grunt work. So my question related to that is, once you start throwing AI into the mix, does the human creativity side start shifting more towards define the world and let the AI tell the story, or does it go the other way? Is there like a systematic tendency in any of these things?
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of actually even during Emissaries, but more especially in Life After Bob, I became obsessed with this narrative theory that came out of USC in the 90s called Dramatica. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but to me, it's like the calculus of narrative, and it's a little bit, steeped in its own kind of jargon. But its basic idea is that like a complete story has sort of 4 threads or 4 perspectives that it's trying to balance, and it's a model of the human mind balancing those perspectives. It has the objective story, which is what everyone in the story cares about, has the main character story, which is what the main character cares about, much more subjective, has a character or structural role called the obstacle character, which is sort of like a foil character to kind of foil the main character. It has a relationship story through line, which is the relationship, the dynamic, or is the relationship growing apart or coming together between the obstacle and main character. And it's a whole calculus of how those things play out into either like a total triumph story, a total tragedy story, or a kind of bittersweet story in between. And there's an amazing guy who called Jim Hull, who like turned down to like, you know, it was classic software in the 90s, but he turned it into like a web application. And then he like integrated ChatGPT into it. And so, you know, it's this thing about strong priors that I think I was going a little bit on and on about with Bob. It's like, okay, ChatGPT, you know, like people have produced amazing things with like super prompts. If you could only super prompt a story at a certain structural level, you might get better stories. And I think he kind of maybe cracked the code a little bit on this by applying the dramatica theory, which is a super strong prior. You can fill in whatever story you want it to be about. But by applying that and then using ChatGPT to generate stuff from each of the, I mean, the theory breaks it down to even like beats within a scene. You can get that granular. He's gotten like pretty interesting recreations of like existing movies. I've used it myself a few times. Like it's pretty satisfying to see like a very particularly constrained scene being ChatGPT kind of just generating ideas that are of specific relevance to me as the writer. And so I found that to be the holiest marriage of the two things so far. I'll put in here, it's called Subtext. That's a service.
Awesome. Toby?
Hey, yeah, thanks for sharing your work with us. Having you know, been to like I think I saw your Emissaries work when it went up at MoMA PS1, and like I've seen a few other things around town in New York. And I understood like that there was like an implicit story like you shared with the emissary character, but I found it like kind of hard to understand, and this talk helped me understand it. Now you've experimented more with like a much more heavily scripted narrative in the short film. I guess I'm curious, like now you've this is kind of a follow-up question to the last one. Like you've now experimented with like 2 forms of storytelling, one kind of automated and one like entirely scripted. What felt like more satisfying, and like how are you thinking about like doing storytelling next?
Good question. You know, I found that in doing the simulations, it was sort of like I didn't know where the goal really was. There's no goalpost in the same way that making a story, you know, like if the story connects, if the arc, you know, evolves some kind of meaning in the viewer's mind, that's sort of my intention. Like, great, there's some way of measuring that. With the simulations, there was no clear goal in the way because it keeps going, and I couldn't predict what would happen. But it produced a lot of interesting both tools and artifacts that I now regularly use, subsystems that I regularly use in all my work. And so it was like bountiful, I think, in making the simulations. I would say making Life After Bob wasn't as bountiful in terms of the stuff that came out of it tangentially, but was more satisfying as I felt like I could complete it. Like I felt like I could actually like finish it. And so it was more satisfying in that regard. Now, I didn't get a chance to show this, but I had since made, you know, a simulation of, there's a small turtle character in Life After Bob, a very minor character, kind of pivotal character. And I thought, okay, became much more interested in AI, like wanted to reapproach that again. Could I use some of the AI model that I developed with Bob, advance it a little bit more, apply that to this secondary character from Life After Bob, the turtle, and sort of really dramatize, you know, turtle like cartoonishly moves very slow. Could I dramatize the day of a turtle and make the drama of its life like, I don't know, walking across the room to get to a little patch of heat, or finding some crumbs or sensing some crumbs across the room, going there. And then the main character of the film, Chalice, she's like her scale is like super big compared to a turtle. She now becomes this force of chaos and interruption. She might drop a bag down or move something, and this just ruins the turtle's day. And the turtle's AI model has to kind of deal with that schism. Yeah, and so yeah, reduces the main character to a secondary character, and not even a character, like a force of nature, and it provokes the AI model to have to like deal with this mismatch with its reality versus its desire. Anyways, this became a very satisfying project that also, I wanted to get around to this, but it took 2 months to make, which is for me record time making a project, like super fast. To put all together like this brand new project using kind of what the learnings of all these other projects, plus the underlying narrative scaffolding from Life After Bob. I have to question what the set was, what the turtle looked like, what Chalice looked like, what the stuff in the room was. That was all pre-given by and anchored by the story that I had kind of parked as the movie, the short film. Now I felt the freedom to do all these experimental things in the world of Life After Bob, with none of the burden of having to make it all up and feel insecure or doubtful about what it is I was making up. So it answered a lot of questions and made me able to accelerate, development of this new AI model and this turtle simulation much faster.
Great, thank you. Nahi?
Yeah, thank you for walks through your works. Yeah, I'm such a huge fan of you. And yeah, I'm wondering, like, because I saw like some of the videos you showed today, and also from like those works I saw from your exhibition, I realized that like your characters like has like those like overlapped and multiple faces like on their appearance, and like they were like trying to escape from the self or like trying to fight each other in like a one body. And like I was wondering, like, is it like presentation of like fighting like selves in like a one characters? And also wondering, like, do you think about their interaction or like some kind of like their negotiation process inside that like a one body, like when they are like interact inside the narratives? That's my question.
Yeah. I think ever since Emissaries, like I was very inspired by the Julian Jaynes book on the origin of consciousness in the bicameral mind, and that already proposed a kind of multiplicity inside. It's also very interesting in Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind. And then, I started reading Eric Berne, and he described this kind of model of like the parent, the adult, and the child within you. And then more recently became obsessed with this neocortex theory of the mind by this guy called Jeff Hawkins. He has a book called Thousand Brains, which proposed that the neocortex, is neurologically the replication of one single cortical structure. It's called a cortical column, one single neural structure that's just repeated. It's like nature got lazy, just repeated, like threw more GPU power at it. But each of those cortical columns is a complete modeling system. And his hypothesis, it's unproven, but it feels true, is that those different cortical columns redundantly model the same thing. So maybe the ones that are right below your visual area, they might be modeling the coffee cup visually, but another part that's actually your like sensorial touch part of your brain, those cortical columns might be modeling what it feels like to touch and move around like a coffee cup. And combined, when you like perceive a coffee cup, both of those areas activate, and sometimes they're in contradiction. I mean, there's the classic thing of the two vases that also look like the vase that looks like two faces, and you have to choose which one to see. So already there's this competition in your mind of redundant modeling of the same thing. I think this was a very elegant solution, both by nature and also as a theory that Jeff Hawkins proposed, and that your what you perceive as real, your conscious experience, you perceive the end product of the voting mechanism that goes. There are certain neurons that go cross-cortical between the cortical columns that are not just hierarchies, they have like kind of cross branches. These are like proposed to be like basically voting mechanisms for which model is the most relevant for the particular motivation you have at hand. And anyways, it's a long way of saying I've been obsessed with this idea of like the multiplicity of mind. I think it's the both most truthful, but also probably the best way to get to like stronger AI. And also it just explains so much more. Like contradiction can exist inside a model of the mind. And then you have a mechanism for resolving that contradiction, even if it's kind of a lie.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Ian, are you able to stick around for a few extra minutes for some final
sure.
questions? Great.
Happy to.
Shano, you had a question?
So I'm interested in how your work borrows elements from movies and, well, from the movie industry and from games, where you have both linear and relatively interactive and non-linear mediums. And I guess this is sort of following up a little bit on Toby's question about the non-linearity of the AI in your art. But I'd be interested in hearing more, I think, with the Bob project, where you introduced interactivity into the project. How did that compare with something like the Emissaries project, where it was nonlinear and unpredictable because it used a basic form of AI? So I guess, like, what's the difference between nonlinearity generated by humans versus by AI?
Yeah, I think I would say with Bob, it was much more satisfying to get human input into, essentially, it's like a village raising a dragon. That's what it felt like with Bob. And that was much more satisfying, especially when the interaction was constrained to I kind of good or bad parenting captions for Bob. So it's quite limited what you could do, but it's very like profound and important to Bob's development as it grows and its AI model kind of accrues rules. So I found that to be probably more satisfying, but I will say, like, it started to veer into video game design, and video game design is, I mean, if any of you have ever done it, it's like exceptionally hard. It's like so hard. Like, you're dealing with a whole other variable, which is like, you know, the human player. And so I didn't take that lightly. I would hardly call it a video game. But beyond that, I think, you know, I'm very inspired by Will Wright, the guy who did The Sims. You know, to date, I still don't think there's anyone else who really makes you fall in love with systems. He's the only person I know, well, at least the only person who's consistently followed this track where, like, you're some abstract kind of entity that's governing over a system, and like The Sims, you're kind of like a sort of like a, I don't know what you are, like the house manager. In like SimCity, you're like an abstract mayor, and you're like dealing with zoning and piping and like very boring things, systemic things that have crazy butterfly effects, but somehow it makes you fall in love with that as a player. Every other game, you're an avatar running through a world, and it's like more direct action. And so I'm really inspired by that. I think he himself would hardly call his games games. They're more like, he demote them to toys, but they're not toys either. I think, I mean, they're simulations. They're kind of like super sculptures or like super toys, where you are encouraged almost like to prod one end, see what happens, and see what one little thing might produce as a butterfly effect, or what a lot of effort produces nothing. This, I think, was very, very, very influential for me. And the last thing I'll say is, like, Miyazaki's been really influential. Spoke to a curator in Japan, and she said that, you know, whatever you think about Miyazaki, whether he's a grumpy guy, you like his movies, dislike them, like 3, 4, 5 generations of children have grown up on Totoro. And you could argue that Totoro is maybe the most influential artwork in Japan, because it's just infected, influenced, incepted itself and its values into every Japanese child's mind. Like, your idea about the countryside, your idea about spirits being like not scary, but actually good. The idea that spirits can only be seen by humans, so it's by children. So it's like kind of like a special secret. These ideas are like influenced in the child. And so for me, like, the idea of doing children's media as a form of artwork is something that I'm trying to pursue right now more and more.
Great. I think we'll wrap it up with a question from Venkat.
All right. Yeah, Ian, I meant to actually ping you to talk about this personally, but I think this audience could also benefit from it. So I think a couple of years after I first saw your work, I was at a talk by Jon Favreau right after The Mandalorian came out. And he was talking about how he built The Mandalorian in a game engine. And that's, of course, like a really huge budget production in sort of, you know, large extended universe. So it seems to me that the work of like kind of like museum or gallery artists like yourself tends to anticipate in an obfuscated way where mainstream movie storytelling is going in a few years. So if you look at the last 10 years, you've gone from like regular movies to like extended universes to stuff like Mandalorian, which is actually better stories than the original Star Wars, set in the interstices of Star Wars. Then you've got, like, you know, Rick and Morty and Everything Everywhere All at Once, that sort of like non-linear meta-modern weirdness. So like, crystal ball, this large scale thing from your perspective, where do you think big Hollywood production and big budget TV shows are going based on what you're seeing in the art world right now?
Well, maybe less of the art world, more the landscape of like AI and crypto. I could see a version of fast forward 10 years from now, even 5 years from now, where like you go to watch a movie, sure, there's a canonical version, or you watch a TV show, there's a canonical version, but there's also a version specifically for you, like hyper specific, and not in the most obvious ways, not like just like, I don't know, putting your like spouse's face in the face of like one of the characters, not so specific, but artfully specific. I can see with all the generative AI stuff, and I can see a world where there's even everyone has some version of a personal model where there's some personality analysis data on a person with permissions. It connects maybe there's some crypto layer where it connects securely to the media itself, where you get a very, very personalized version of a story. Maybe it's a branch off of the canonical version. I do think why does it have to be a branch? I also think like there's something very satisfying to all of us knowing we've seen the same, I don't know, episode of whatever, Succession or The Mandalorian. Like then we can just kind of have the same reference point and we feel that we've seen the same thing. There's some continuity there. I think when that's broken and you get something as personal as like generative AI movies, you're going to want to maintain some balance of some social contract of continuity that we can all appreciate. And so somehow that balance will have to be worked out. How that is, I'm not sure, but I can see a version of that, like super personal, specific stories for you that connect to a universe or a world that we all understand. So like Boba Fett would like behave toward you, Venkat, the way he would behave toward me. He's still congruent in his character, but maybe, he said something very kind of more specific to me in my version.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for spending some time with us, talking us through your work and answering some questions for us. Really appreciate your attention here. We will be having another session on Friday with Matt Webb at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we will see you all then.
Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.